I would like to now introduce our first keynote speech and the day. And today we're meeting under the topic of reconciliation in turbulent times. I tried to translate this to German and had a big discussion what turbulent might mean, and if it's an understatement or an exaggeration. We will surely find out what all of you associate with this throughout the day. We have Rev Sam McBratney today with us. He is a Methodist minister and an experienced reconciler. His life and work weave together peace, justice, and reconciliation. And in an era of constant and instant activity, from ordering a dinner to messaging friends and family, it's important to recognize that the vital task of reconciliation takes time, energy, and practice, and it's a continuous task. So we have the pleasure to have some time and you with us to explore the long road to reconciliation and what that might mean. So, Sam, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to it.
Wonderful. And it's really good to be with you. Apologies if I appear a little tired and jaded. I've spent most of the last 10 days in windowless rooms talking about some things that matter, many things that seem not to matter quite so much. But yes, it is very good to be here. And I was given a brief to talk a little bit about digging in for the long haul. And about the practice of reconciliation, particularly as we know over the longer term, and I hope that I'll stimulate some questions and conversation. I think it's a pure coincidence that we meet today exactly on the 50th anniversary of the first Pride March in the UK, and all that has done over the last 50 years. I don't know whether other people picked up last night. The Channel 4 has done a survey of LGBTQ plus people in the UK in the light of the 50th anniversary, and asked various questions like, do LGBTQ plus people feel that all of equality and rights have been achieved? 2% said that they had. And 40% of people interviewed had faced homophobic bullying or some other incident in the last 12 months. Anything from violent attack to discrimination of various sorts. Which puts in some sort of context the many times when, as an openly gay person in the Methodist Church, I get asked many times, well, everything's okay now, isn't it? And I wonder whether is that a statement or a question. And we might want to talk about microaggressions in this time. But let's begin with me and some background, which may give some indication about why I find myself in the position of being involved in reconciliation. I was born in 1971 in a town called Newton Ards in County Down. And in the first year of my life, we had various things happen in that part of the world. Bloody Sunday happened within just over a month of my birth. The fall of the Northern Ireland government then happened a couple of months later, and direct rule was imposed. And by the time of my first birthday, 500 people had been killed in the north of Ireland. These are some pictures that were certainly familiar to me growing up, and I imagine were probably quite familiar to you. Because and all of this shaped in many ways not only my attitudes to life, but also where I find myself and where I find myself today. I was born into a family that is incredibly loyalist. I have members of my family who have been convicted for terrorist offences and served time in prison, and still members of my family, wider family, who are senior members of paramilitary organisations. And so I grew up in a time where division and sectarianism were normal. Violence was widespread, even though in our part it was fairly minimal in terms of physical violence. And alongside all of that violence, there was also the daily outrage particularly of church leaders who would appear on television and tell us how outraged they were by the latest atrocity. But though I grew up in a community that was 96% Protestant and 4% Catholic, constantly I felt that I was part and was told that I was part of a community that was under threat, and that our identity at any point could be wiped away by the other. In terms of where the church was, my family were not very, we had a church we didn't attend very often, like most people in Ireland. But it would be fair to say that my experience, particularly of Protestant churches, including the Methodist Church, of which I eventually became a member, acted in the way that David Irvine once described the paramilitary and political leader. He said that when the churches picked up the chalice of peace, it had 400 years of dust on it. And that was certainly my experience of a Protestantism and a Methodism that simply didn't work when it came to this, and where it was certainly part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Having said that, my own father, in particular, who died during the COVID epidemic the year before last, was somewhat countercultural. And so even though he was a Protestant and part of a very loyalist family, he was a caretaker in the local Catholic school. My sisters all have Irish names and all did Irish dancing, which was only possible to do that by going to the local Catholic school for that. And so that when we moved into our council housing, when I was 4, the next day when we woke up, that daubed on the walls were Fenians out all round, because the assumption was that we were a Catholic family moving into a Protestant area. And when my father went to the police to report it, he was told a bit of Terps would get it off the window. And no other action was taken against the people who did that. So I grew up as, particularly because of my father, but I feel as if I grew up as an outsider. Always feeling a bit different. With many, and throughout my life, I felt as if I've always been on the edge of something, and I think that for good or ill. My best friends, when I was growing up, were Catholics, one of the very few Catholic families on the estate. And so I was called various names. I mean, I grew up being called Fenian Lover, because I was friends with Catholics. So when they were beating up my friends, they were also involving me in that. But I just, and for at various parts of my life, various things have been said of me, or to me. Looking back, I now see that part of the reason for that is twofold. One, that I was a gay man, and that therefore I didn't quite fit into the very strong gender groupings that were part of my society and church, remembering, of course, that homosexuality was decriminalised in the north of Ireland in 1982 and in the Republic of Ireland in 1993. So 1967, no change had happened on the island of Ireland. But I have also only recently discovered that I also I'm neurodivergent and have ADHD, although that was not even thought about when I was growing up at school. But the one, and all of that, the one term that seems to encapsulate many of those other things is that I've often been labelled a troublemaker, particularly by people in power or running institutions. In later years, I found a language, and the language is helpful in that for what often happens in the use of that term, and others may feel the same, that I came across only latterly, the term tone policing. I don't know whether anybody's come across tone policing, or gaslighting. And tone policing is when people come up to people like me who are leading on a justice issue or wanting change, and often, behind their hands, very quietly, they say, well, of course, we completely agree with what you want to do, but do you have to be so angry about it? Do you have to be so upset? Because actually then you're undermining your own case, because if you were just more reasonable, then things would happen. In response to that, I'm very grateful that Penguin recently produced a series of little books, and I wish I brought one with me, for £1 of particularly poignant essays or speeches. And one is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And it seems to me that if you, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it, and if you've read it, it seems to me the perfect answer to tone policing. Because, of course, the reason he wrote the letter was not because his enemies or his opponents were writing to him, but his friends and those who supported him, to say exactly that, well, Martin, if you just tone it down a bit, it'll all be all right. And so he writes back the letter from Birmingham jail, in which he says, and I have a lot of sympathy, he said, give me the Ku Klux Klan any day over white moderates. And so often, certainly I have found that it's not the fire I've got to worry about from the opponents. It's the friendly fire coming from behind that we have to be careful about. So when people do tone police me now, I simply put a copy of the letter from Birmingham jail in the post and ask them to reflect on that. And we can come back to any and all of this. In terms of my own CV, how did I get into reconciliation? Well, I kind of fell into it, I'll have to be honest. I had spent a number of years in circuit in this country, and particularly in one circuit, encountered not only a fair degree of homophobia, but a badly handled, when things were done and said, it was handled incredibly badly by the powers that be, who, I think one quote was, well, you tell us you're innocent and then we'll support you. And I thought, well, I'm not British, but I think British justice says that's an assumption. From, we're very well-meaning Methodist ministers and leaders. And so in the end, I felt that the only option was to leave and go into chaplaincy. I was a part-time university chaplaincy, go into university chaplaincy full-time, and I ended up at City University in London. And just as it happened, during my time, the Olive Tree programme was instituted. And you probably know what that is, but a very brief summary. The Olive Tree programme brought together over a number of years a group of young Jewish Israelis and Palestinians from various parts of the region to come to the UK to study for a degree full-time, and whilst they were doing that, to meet on a weekly basis to engage in conversation and dialogue around the issues involved in living in the Middle East and being part of Israel-Palestine. And so I was, for all sorts of reasons, eventually was roped into that and spent 5 years of working with different groups of young Israelis and Palestinians in that journey. As a result of that, actually, bizarrely, it was through the Middle East that I re-engaged with Ireland, because a lot of the work that we did with the Olive Tree programme involved the Coromilla community in their facilitation. And so I ended up becoming a member of the Coromilla community and starting to do bits and pieces of work back home. But out of that, and that experience, and it was very much on-the-job training of the Olive Tree, that I found myself also being drawn into other places and other parts of the world, particularly, actually, Sri Lanka. And I've been working in Sri Lanka and with Sri Lankans for the last 10 years or so, mainly with the Methodist Church and also with the Ecumenical theological college, in engaging with young, new clergy in how they become reconcilers and peacemakers in their own when they leave and go into parish and circuit. And that has been an incredibly difficult and also rewarding practice. And we may want to come back and say a little bit more about that. Through that, I then ended up spending a few years working at the Queen's Foundation, not far from here, and setting up and running a global program of leadership for church leaders from the global south, which involved a significant amount of reconciliation and conflict studies. And that was, again, led to some involvement in Rwanda and other parts of the world in thinking through and preparing people to engage in reconciliation and using the tools of theology to do that. In terms of the church, and the Methodist Church in particular, obviously in the last 10 years, we've had in society, more widely in society, a whole conversation around same-sex marriage or equal marriage. And that has led to a lot of work, both within the officialdom and outside, in terms of campaigning and struggling and talking around not only ensuring that we get equal marriage in the Methodist Church, which as of last year we have in the British Methodist Church, but also to engage in conversation around how we live together as a church that holds, the term we use is contradictory convictions. And that came out of a report a long time ago that came to, well, that at least highlighted for Methodists that there are many issues in Christian churches on which we Christians profoundly disagree, but that their positions are equally scriptural and equally well thought through, but are completely at odds with one another. The one that we often highlight is pacifism versus just war. And where we have come to the position, only recently it seems to me, but we have come to the position that you can be a Christian pacifist or you can be a Christian serving in the armed forces or as a chaplain, and the arguments and the rationale are equally valid. But there will be no convergence. There's no common ground in that struggle. And I think at the moment, it seems to me, certainly for the Methodist Church in Britain, but also elsewhere, there is still, the jury is still out in some ways around the place and position of LGBTQ people within the life and leadership of the church. And so what do we do in the meantime is one of the questions, or how do we, within that framework, live well together? And so I began working with conservative evangelical leaders to start talking about, well, how do we do this? And ended up, so others say, modeling a way of living together that is not about agreement. That one of the things that was very clear, and I brought from my reconciliation experience, was that the idea that the only form of success is agreement needs to be completely eradicated, that you can disagree successfully, and that relationships are not based on agreement. And yet that seems to be a prevailing ethos that still pervades too much of our talk around conflict and reconciliation. And so, along with others, I helped to found an organization called Dignity and Worth, which campaigned for equal marriage, which we now have, which now has over 500 members and has become a significant voice for justice and for reconciliation within the Methodist Church in Britain and elsewhere. And so the two pieces of work, I think, without boring you about my CV too much longer, that I'm now currently involved in, actively, one is working with the Council of Bishops of the United Methodist Church, which is going through a very different process with regard to sexuality and relationships and justice, and will, by 2024, probably have divided into two significant groups. But working with them to see, well, what is the way forward, where it seems very clear that people do not wish to be even in the same room as each other. And also with the Methodist Church as one of the co-chairs of the new Justice, Dignity and Solidarity Committee, which is working at not just equality, diversity and inclusion issues and statutory obligations, but in bringing about a root and branch cultural and systemic change to eradicate prejudice and discrimination of all forms in our church. And we're given a few years to do that. So wish us luck on that. What have I learnt in all of that, in all of this time? Not very much, I would say, but I thought this was illustrative of the conversations that I have, particularly with church folk, all too often, whether it's about LGBTQ plus justice, or whether it's about anti-racism, or whatever we're talking about, is that, yes, the principle must be, first of all, do no harm, but how do you do that? And it seems to me that there are two extremes. What one is, and I don't know, some of you may be familiar with the conflict iceberg. Conflict iceberg. But I put that up to say that actually often in a presenting conflict, only a very small proportion of it is seen. But that underneath, there are all kinds of things that are supporting and maintaining a conflict and will actually maintain it long after the people who are actually involved have stopped. And one of the key things for me in this is the power of other people getting involved to support the actors who are on the ground. And I saw that I see it in the Methodist Church too, but I saw it during the Olive Tree programme because whilst the people on the ground who were living with this reality day by day were actually quite open to conversations and dialogue about coming to an arrangement that would not be perfect, but at least would be better than now, the people who claimed to be their supporters in the background were absolutely adamant that only a zero-sum win-lose was possible. And that if anything approaching compromise was to be happened, they would wreck it. They would actively intervene to destroy it. And unfortunately, in a lot of the conversations around Israel-Palestine I hear today, it is people telling me that there is no compromise and that whether they are pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, that they will, this is how it will be. This is how it will be. And no wonder then people on the ground are, particularly Palestinians, I have to say, are reluctant to make any moves towards peace because they will be seen as traitors to those people, the wider thing, and traitors to the cause, and probably then assassinated. So what is it, in order to do no harm, people are wanting, a lot of us want to be very active, want to be very involved, but actually how do we get involved in a way that doesn't do further harm, doesn't exacerbate the situation? And sadly, I think, I have to hold my hands up, in the Israel-Palestine thing, I think we have got to that place. And lots of conversation, which seems to be very little about the people on the ground and very much about the people out of the room. And just hardening lines across the piece. But then people say, well, if intervening will be harmful, what I'll do is nothing. And I'll do no harm if I do exactly nothing. And I have a wonderful quote by the greatest poet of the 20th century, Seamus Heaney. He said, "No such thing as innocent bystanding." And I hear that all too often, is that when conflicts, small or large, within the church or more widely, people say, well, if I do, I can't, I don't know what to do, so I will do nothing, and therefore I have fulfilled my obligations. And I was reflecting on this on the way here, and thinking, particularly when I was talking to people over the weekend or over a conference about when incidents of discrimination happen in the church. Somebody says something active or does something that excludes someone, and the church leader says, Well, we've got to take a pastoral approach to this rather than a justice approach, which means that they don't call out the bad behaviour, and they are nice to the people who perpetrate the injustice rather than the people who are affected by it. And I think that implies something that is never true. It implies that when a conflict happens of any sort, the power relation is equal on both sides. But I want to say that all the evidence suggests that conflicts only arise when there is a power imbalance. It is only when one is more powerful than the other that conflict occurs. So if a conflict has occurred, there will always be a power imbalance. So treating both sides equally is to collude in that conflict and to take the side of the more powerful over the less powerful. And if you take away nothing else, I would take away that learning is to say, you cannot say, oh yes, but a plague on all your houses, or it's all very complicated on both sides. No. Conflict is caused by power imbalance, and therefore it's incumbent upon us to analyse where the power lies and to intervene to make sure there is balance, which will mean taking the side of the less powerful. Quickly to run through and then open it to questions, is to say, I was asked to talk about what has kept me going in all of this. And I'll just put these up and then I'll talk a little bit about some of them. In terms of a Christian approach, a theological, spiritual approach, I've put up these words because I think all of them have some impinge in some way, I think, on how Christians in particular, and more widely people of goodwill, engage in reconciliation and understand it. For me, the most powerful aspect of the gospel in this work is resurrection. Why do I say that? I say that because resurrection is the ground of hope that says, no matter how bad things are, no matter how dreadful, that new life is possible, that transformation is possible, and that God is active in that situation to bring that about. And I think if you do not believe in resurrection, well, as Paul said, we're above all people to be pitied. But I think there is something fundamental about resurrection as the ground of hope. Otherwise, it's just naive optimism that things might get better. Resurrection says things will get better because God has promised, and God is active in making that right. And so that's the first thing that grounds me is when I'm feeling, oh my God, nothing's ever going to get better, or this is as good as it gets, which is I hear in church all the time. This is as good as it gets. That is a denial of the gospel of resurrection. I think the other fundamental thing, which gets me into all kinds of hot water, is forgiveness. Because the amount of people I hear now who simply deny that forgiveness is possible in lots of situations. And it seems to me that it remains the heart of the gospel and cannot be taken away. But when I talk to Christians about forgiveness, what I normally get is, oh, but we can't let people get away with it. And we can't forget, you're asking victims you're coercing victims into doing it. I don't think anything I've ever said has suggested that. And that we can't have forgive and forget. I think, well, that's not in the gospel either. But if I read the New Testament, and particularly the form of justice that is outlined in the New Testament, I do not see any other form of justice than restorative justice in the cross. And that the point of forgiveness and the point of justice is relationship and reconciliation, is to bring us all into right. I became an evangelical as a teenager, and I've never forgotten that great. What is the point of forgiveness and the cross? To bring us into right relationship, and that means to bring us into just relationships with each other. Not just the kind of vertical, but the horizontal as well. And I think unless Christians go back to Scripture and engage again with what are we asking in forgiveness. Not cheap grace, not coercion, but the really fundamental forgiveness, which is about relationship and rebuilding a beloved community in which everyone is part. Not just some, but everyone. It is the most difficult thing in the world, and yet it is, for me, nothing less than the gospel. And it costs. It's not easy. It's why I refuse to use the term inclusion, because when people use the term inclusion, particularly white people like me, they mean that, oh, thank God, we just have to open our doors and maybe put out a few chairs, but fundamentally, we'll be inviting people who are not like that, us, to come to our place, to sit on our premises, to follow our rules, and where actually, fundamentally, we'll feel better about ourselves because they're there, but fundamentally, we won't have to change. And actually, it seems to me that inclusion is the complete opposite of that. Inclusion is about being with people you don't like. I often say that church is a great training ground because it teaches us how to love people we don't like very much. And that's the point. And too many places in our society have become exclusive places where the people we don't like or the views we don't like are simply silenced and not present. So we become these echo chambers. And sadly, too many of our churches have become echo chambers, where they have become monochrome places where people who think the right things, all agree with me, all come to church. And therefore, when we know that that's not the case, we simply don't talk about it. So afraid that actually that might upset the status quo. Because, and this is, and I will draw this to a close, I think. Oh no, well, that clock is faster than my watch, so I'll go by my watch. I'm a member of the World Methodist Council, and at the last meeting of the World Methodist Council, we had a bishop, Bishop Daniel, from the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which is a black majority church in the United States, get up to preach to us. And he said, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. He said, the good news is they've given me 20 minutes. He said, the bad news is I just don't care. And thank God that he didn't care, because it was an extraordinarily moving act of worship. But I think one of the things that I found most worrying in wider culture and the church is that we have failed to learn how to deal with imperfection. Is that we want the solutions to our problems to be perfect. We want the people who lead us to be perfect. And that therefore, if they show any flaws, or if the solution is not endorsed unanimously, there's something wrong with it, and that we want to take it away. And there's something about that is deeply worrying, if we cannot live with imperfection. One of my constant inspirations and heroes is Dr. Martin Luther King. He is still my hero in light of all that we know about the issues he had with women and the things that went on, whilst he was leading the movement. But it seems to me that if we have a thing that says if someone is flawed, it undoes all the good work that they've done, or that all the good work can erase the flaws and the bad stuff that they've done. It seems to me we failed in a Christian anthropology about who we are as human beings, and yet we listen to that all the time. Is that, and I worry that with that unwillingness to engage in imperfection, we then simply move away from redemption. That redemption then stops being possible. Certain people are beyond the pale. And so it may surprise you to say it as a good Christian radical, but I think we need to talk about sin again. And I think we've forgotten what that means. And that we are all sinners saved by grace. And unless we get back into that kind of language, that is what our society needs to hear. That sin is not an excuse, and being a sinner is an excuse, but it is a reality. And that there is a remedy in that. And the two final things, and we'll come back to some others if you want, is one is the power of story. we will have picked that up, it seems to me, most clearly in the conversations I'm sure all of us have had, online or in person, on vaccines and COVID. And the anti-vaxxers versus the pro-vaxxers, in which, and I have been approached by various members of family things, how do I convince an anti-vaxxer that they're wrong? And I say it will have nothing to do with facts. It'll have nothing to do with facts. This is about stories. We tell ourselves stories, and I said, you know, for 70 years we have known that smoking kills. Yes? Smoking will kill you if something else doesn't get you first. 1 billion people in the world still smoke today. 1 in 8 people still smokes today, 70 years after we found out it was. And every smoker I've known, I've been a smoker myself, but every smoker who still smokes tells me that they know somebody who lived to the age of 90, smoked 100 a day, and didn't even have a cough. All right? Because that's the story, the truth that they live by. Not on what they read on the side of their fag packet. Okay? So, because actually that's how we live. We live by stories. We do not live by reading scientific journals or lists of facts. And actually, as Christians, we should not be surprised by that because we are a storied people. We are a people who live by a narrative. And that narrative is often completely countercultural to what's going on beyond. Nevertheless, we live by that narrative. And finally, to say, I would have to end with a Methodist word, connection, spelt correctly, not incorrectly with an X, that John Wesley, one of his passions was the Bible knows nothing of solitary religion. And one of the things that troubles me again within the Christian context is the idea that if you are to do justice work, you must do it alone. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. Of course, if you read the book of Daniel, you will know Daniel didn't stand alone. What about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Right? Is actually we read the Bible through the lens of heroic leadership. And yet, if you read it more carefully, you will know that each of those people, Moses, well, he wasn't a leader by himself. Jesus didn't travel alone. Paul didn't travel alone. They had people around them. And we have chosen to read it through the lens of, oh yes, they are heroes and they did it all by themselves. And I think that actually stops justice work rather than promotes it. Because what it says to us is nobody else feels like we do. And it's easier to pick off individuals. And so I invite you to go back and read the Bible and see how often, when we have read leadership as individual, it has actually been shared. And other people have been around to do that. And because that's the point. When we come together, that's when we support, and we will never do it alone. We can only do it together. And that quote, and this is a quote that always inspires me. It's the bit of the Beatitudes that people tend to not read after they've read the others. This comes out immediately after "Blessed are the peacemakers." Is that when people say, "But what if it makes me unpopular or people disagree?" I say, "Well, why are you surprised? Well, why are you surprised that people disagree, particularly religious people?" Is that the greatest opponents of John the Baptist and Jesus were not the Romans, were not the political powers. There was the religious authorities who didn't like it and so persecuted. And sadly, that is still the case today. Is that good people of faith will do their best to undermine justice work within the church and beyond it. May not even know that they're doing it, but nevertheless are doing it because religion, at its worst, simply endorses and gives a rationale to the status quo. And there is much in which, in the arguments, and I will shut up after this. I've been very taken with all of the conversation around Black Lives Matter, and was in such a conversation where Methodists, if you've ever been in a conversation about Black Lives Matter with Methodists, you will have heard, I have no doubt, that John Wesley's last letter was to William Wilberforce, telling him to, supporting his fight to abolish slavery. He sat on that letter for 40 years, and he preached at the funeral of George Whitefield, another founder of the Methodist Church, who not only owned slaves, but wrote a biblical defense of slavery. So that's also part of our Methodist heritage. And actually, there's a statue of George Whitefield at the University of Pennsylvania that is currently being taken down that not many Methodists will tell you about. He was a Methodist leader too, great Methodist leader. But actually, unless we talk about the whole of our history, the whole of it, the good and the bad, that we are sinners as well as saints, that I don't think we can really grasp what it is to move forward. We weren't always on the side of the angels, and we're not always on the side of the angels now. But that actually is a good thing in terms of where we are in terms of bringing change. I think I will stop on that note and invite questions, comments. I don't know what's happening next, so someone will fill me in about how long people have got and what they're doing. Oh, 10 minutes left. Thank you very much. Yes, in fact, you just give me your name and a little bit about it. Just gives me a context and other people.
I'm John, and I'll just introduce myself to you by saying I lived in Derry for 11 years during the Troubles. There's so much in that, Sam. Thank you very, very much. Although it would have been good to hear Justine, I don't think any of us are regretting her accents anymore. There's so many things one could pick up. I just want to pick up one. I'd like you to say a bit more about something you said, which I agree with, that when there's conflict, there's inequality. Because that doesn't help me enough about what to do about that. And if I can take a very specific example to point it up. Conflict between parents and their children. I would do whatever I could see to do to oppose parents tyrannizing their children. But I don't want to disempower children either. And if we have some thoughts about what do you do when the power imbalance is A, inevitable, and B, not necessarily evil in itself. If we knew that, if we could work that out, perhaps in the family, it might help us with some minority-majority disputes as well.
John, thank you. And I think you're right. Is that I think the reason I said that was because too often when conflict happens, I mean certainly I hear church leaders and others say, or even in terms of. And I had it in my own family with parents to say, but when siblings fight, that there's an assumption that they're equally right, equally wrong. And actually that gives us a sense of injustice. We know that that's not the case. And we can all point to an example from childhood when that was done, and it has left us with a burning sense of injustice. And that's important to hold on to that, is to say, that there is always power at play, and a lot of Christians deny there's any power at play in this stuff, and that we all have power in the situation. So it's not that power is the problem, it is the imbalance and the use and abuse of the power, how the power is exercised, that is key. And what Christians say is either let's remove all the power from the situation, well that's and sometimes disempower everybody, and that also is not helpful. And I've had that with conservative evangelicals, where certainly in the debate around LGBTQ justice or marriage, we've simply been told, well, actually, you're the problem, and if you people on both sides went away, we could all the rest of us can get on with stuff, could get on with being nice to each other, but you are the problem. And have been demonized on both, on both sides of that, as if there were only two sides. So I think it's important to do the analysis, and I think it's important to engage in ways that empower the less powerful. So in that kind of situation, we know that. I mean, I'm a parent myself. I mean, but in those situations, it is about ensuring that people are heard, and that in being heard, not just listened to, but heard. And in being heard, that the situation then changes in some ways, that is picked up and dealt with. There's no point just denying it or silencing people, which is what we do. So I think in those kinds of situations, it's always about, I've always said to and that's also when it comes to our use of confidentiality, I mean, my view of the Methodist Church, we need to really review how we use confidentiality, because it's often secrecy. And my view on confidentiality is I'm all for pastoral confidentiality as long as it protects the most vulnerable. But when it protects the more powerful in the relationship, that's secrecy. And we've seen the damage that that has done in terms of child abuse in churches and all kinds of things, because actually the institution has benefited, not the victims and the vulnerable. And so there's always that analysis, is to say, well, you may use the same tools, but you have to do an analysis about what effect they're going to have. Yeah. And I think that, for me, is we don't do enough of that, because we're so busy just wanting to dampen everything down, because we believe at heart that disagreement is wrong. And that is somehow a failure. And the disagreement is failure. We have failed as leaders if we have disagreement. Yes.
Sam, thank you very much for that. My name's Gordon. I come from Hine Street Methodist Church in central London. I would love to come and preach that sermon at our church. I think that'd be fantastic. But what I want to ask is...
we'll talk about why afterwards.
If the goal of reconciliation is not to reach agreement, what is it? Because take an industrial dispute, it has to end in an agreement. If you take a conflict like Ukraine, it's got to end either in the defeat of one side or the other, or it's got to end in some sort of agreement. I take the point about contradictory convictions and living with them, but what is the goal?
Yes, I think, but because actually there are different, in terms, if you take something like Ukraine, there are different outcomes. Ukraine reminds me why I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist because should the Ukrainians have arms to defend themselves? Yes, I believe fundamentally they should. And if they don't have those things, even more of them will die, and tyranny will win. And so, in terms of this particular phase, the end result must be, I hope, that the Russians are driven out of Ukraine. And back to the borders that they had pre-2014. But I also know that might not happen, that there might be a compromise that means that they keep Crimea, or that something happens in the Donbass, or all kinds of possibilities will come out of that. But that's only to stop the fighting. If you want then to bring about genuine, because the thing about reconciliation is never about solving the last conflict, it's always about stopping the next one. And if you want to stop the next one, there will then have to be a process by which these things become less possible. That Russia cannot just simply walk across borders when it feels like it, or any powerful thing cannot just come and play out its power games. That's a longer term issue. Whatever comes out of this, in terms of industrial disputes, and I'm also a trade unionist, is to say that. In a particular dispute, it may be zero-sum win-lose, but the ultimate point of trade unions, as I often have to remind Methodists, is that we want better working conditions for everybody. And actually, if employees are happier, they actually are more productive. So everybody wins if you have and we all know that. It used to be the case, no longer because Marks and Spencers have changed, but it used to be said by trade unionists, if every employer was Marks and Spencer, we wouldn't need trade unions. Because we know that they retain staff, that good employers retain staff, get lots of productivity, get lots of loyalty, and actually generally because the power imbalance there isn't a power imbalance. It isn't about one person deciding over another. So we know it's a win-win, but getting to that point where other interests come in and cutting corners and saving money and all of that, it's counterproductive. We know that. And in those countries, like in other parts of Europe, for example, not here because the British always had opt-outs, is that European law said that trade unionists used to have to be appointed. In most other European countries, trade union leaders are appointed to the boards of companies because it's important to have their voice on the board talking about how to make the company work. And when the British joined in, they made sure they got an opt-out of that, so they didn't have to put trade unionists on the board. So we end up with kinds of disputes where people, and then of course we've got the iceberg. Whatever's going on the rail thing, we're then all being asked to be part of that iceberg, is to say, well, you're being upset, so you join the anti-strikers if you're a commuter. And we let's divide and rule, and let's demonize those people. And all they're asking for is a fair wage that won't even constitute a rise. It'll only offset a bit of inflation. it's a ridiculous state of affairs. But in that kind of thing, I think sometimes you do need to create crises. Martin Luther King was very clear that you have to create a crisis in order to get people to take things seriously. But actually, that's a tactic towards the goal, which is not to defeat people, but to defeat the way that things are done, and processes and injustices, so that we can all live better together. That, for me, is and at the end of the day, whatever you do, and I've been talking with Methodist leaders in Ukraine and in Russia, is to say, what do we do after this? And what's your role going to be? Because we can't have Ukrainians hating Russians and Russians hating Ukrainians. We're going to have to start working on how to build bridges again, because that's you always have to. That's the cost. Anyway, yes.
Sam, just partly on what you've just covered, but also your own background.
Yeah.
You grew up in a militarised part of the UK. We've seen Ukraine suddenly militarise its own civilian population. Sort of looking back, what impact do you think growing up with violence and guns on such a sort of state level had on you, and what does that mean we should now think about when talking about things like peace in Ukraine or other divided countries?
Thank you. And it only strikes me actually that what effect it had when I go to places like Israel or the United States, particularly the red states. Because when I see people carrying guns, civilians or people, I feel safe. And when I came to Britain in the early 90s, one of the things that really made me feel unsafe was that the police was unarmed. Having grown up with an armed police force and with the army on the streets, is to say, because the narrative, but you imbibe this idea that guns make you safe. And you've got people there that if something happens, they will be there to protect you. And then you come to here and you think, oh my God, who's going to protect me? They're going to blow a whistle if someone attacks me. And actually you see that in the narrative in the United States and in Israel, but in the United States is to say, we need to protect we need to protect ourselves. And actually what happens is, of course, you then invest all of your security in those things, so that when it comes to saying, well, we have to give those things up, you're asking people to give up their security. And so it becomes a spiral. It becomes a spiral that only those things make us safe. And that may be, like in Belfast, a peace wall, or it might be in Israel-Palestine, the separation barrier. People invest in those tangible things because they think that's and therefore they stop thinking about safety because it's all of that. But the other side of that, I have a friend whose dad was a chief superintendent in the RUC and the police force during the Troubles. And when he retired, they wanted to move into a new house. And it may sound weird, but there are plenty of houses in the north of Ireland that have bulletproof glass in the windows. Okay, and he bought a house from a former member of Parliament because it had bulletproof glass in the windows. Now, most of you probably wouldn't be able to recognise bulletproof glass. Everybody from the north of Ireland will know immediately what bulletproof glass looks like and where it is, and a car or anything. Oh yeah, we know what that is. And they moved in, and within 6 months they had to have it taken out because it triggered PTSD in his father. Because he couldn't go out because he was only safe because of these things around him. And that's there are plenty of sermons talked about trust and things, but actually that's what it becomes. The trust becomes sticking with our own, putting up barriers, having weapons, all of that stuff, and trying to detox from that is almost impossible. It's almost impossible because it's just we give that up in terms, and think about those things that make you safe, that you're glad, and you probably don't even notice them but you'll notice if they're not there. Yes, please, thank you.
Just a comment. I was fascinated that you felt unsafe coming here, the policemen weren't armed, because the opposite happened for me. By going from England to live in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, I felt very unsafe because the police were armed.
Yes. Yes.
So it's what you've grown up with, isn't it?
And I remember, because I'd never quite understood why particularly African Americans believed in the Second Amendment. I'd never really understood that, given the amount of African Americans who are murdered every year. it was Condoleezza Rice who said, whose father was a pastor in the South, and she comes from the South, who said her father always believed in the Second Amendment, because he said not only the police should be armed, he said we need to arm ourselves against the police. And actually, in that context, completely understand that where you have seen police brutality and the police arm, that actually, yeah, that there is a kind of but again, the escalation of that, which is the problem, is that the escalation is very hard then to de-escalate. And we see that in all kinds of communities that are, including in the north of Ireland, that are stuck in sectarianism because they just don't feel safe to move out. All right, thank you. Well, thank you for your I think people can be in conversation. You'll explain. All right.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your perspectives and sharing from your experiences. I'm sure there's lots of things that we can continue discussing or asking questions about.